Hello, survivors. Thanks for joining us today. Before we begin, if you enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel. It really means a lot. Also, tell us in the comments which city you're listening from. It's great to see how far our community reaches. Now, let's start the story. Death has a smell. It's not always unpleasant, not like in the movies. Sometimes it's faint, a bit sweet, sometimes metallic, sometimes just still. An absence of the sense of life. Sweat, perfume, food, breath. I've worked with death for 15 years here at Hawthorne & Sons, long enough to know its nuances, its subtle vocabulary. But the smell that hit me when they wheeled in Mr. Abernathy that Tuesday morning wasn't right. It was underneath the expected notes of stillness, something sharp, coppery, like rust and bad meat simmering on low heat. Wrong. Mr. Abernathy was our first call of the day. Just after 8 a.m., police report said violent assault, deceased on scene. Usually that meant gunshot, knife wound, blunt force trauma, things you could see, identify, document. But Abernathy, he was messy, yes, torn clothing, bruising, but the primary damage was around the neck and shoulders. Bites, deep ragged bites that looked almost frenzied. Not clean like an animal attack, more like a human tearing with desperation, with a shocking lack of precision. And the lividity, the way the blood settled after death was off, too pronounced in some areas, oddly absent in others, patchy, uneven. Rigor mortis was setting in faster than textbook too, his jaw already stiffening as I examined the bite marks. Rough one, Ben commented, wheeling the gurney toward the prep room. Ben was my assistant, barely a year out of mortuary school. Still occasionally green around the gills, but learning fast. He had a good eye, usually. Something's weird about these bites, Ben, I said, pulling on fresh gloves. Look at the tissue damage, almost looks like chewing. Ben leaned closer, then recoiled slightly. Yeah, nasty. Maybe some kind of animal got to him after? Maybe, I said, unconvinced. Animals usually go for softer areas, don't leave. Patterns this erratic. And the smell. That coppery rot wasn't typical decomposition, not this early. I made notes on the intake form. Male, mid-50s, multiple bite wounds, neck, shoulder trauma, anomalous lividity, accelerated rigor. Cause of death pending coroner's report, likely exsanguination. We got Abernathy onto the stainless steel table. The prep room was my sanctuary. Gleaming surfaces, organized instruments, the hum of the ventilation system, the faint chemical scent of formaldehyde and disinfectant. It was a place of order, process, respect. We treated the dead with dignity here, preparing them for their final viewing, offering families a last image of peace. It was methodical work, demanding precision and a certain emotional distance. But today, the usual calm felt precarious. Outside, more sirens than usual cut through the morning quiet of our suburban town. As I began the preliminary cleaning of Abernathy's wounds, I noticed something else. A faint tremor in the pectoral muscle. Just below the clavicle. A post-mortem spasm not uncommon as nerves fired their last signals. But this one seemed persistent. A tiny, rhythmic flutter. I pressed down on the muscle. It stopped, then started again a few seconds after I removed my hand. See that? I asked Ben, pointing. He peered at it. Muscle twitch? Happens sometimes, right? Yeah, but usually not this long after death and not so rhythmic. I made another note. The wrongness was piling up, small inconsistencies that individually meant little, but together felt like a dissonant chord in the symphony of death I knew so well. The phone in the prep room rang. Eleanor's extension. Eleanor Hawthorne ran. The place. Inherited it from her father. Stern, practical, focused on the bottom line, but fair. Art. Her voice crackled through the intercom. County coroner's office just called. They're swamped. Said they had multiple DOAs overnight, all. Violent incidents, similar bite patterns. Asked if we could handle temporary storage for a few if they run out of room at the morgue. Swamped? "Since when does the county morgue run out of room?" I asked. "Sounds like a bad night," Eleanor replied briskly. "Flu season hitting hard. Maybe. People get delirious. Just make sure Abernathy is prepped for storage, not viewing, until we get the official report, and keep the cooler clear." She hung up. Multiple DOAs, similar bites. A knot tightened in my stomach. I looked back at Abernathy on the table, the tremor in his chest now accompanied by a faint twitch in his eyelid. This wasn't the flu. By 11 a.m., 2 more bodies had arrived, both victims of alleged assaults, both displaying the same ragged bite, wounds primarily on the upper body and neck. Both had the same patchy lividity, the same accelerated rigor, and that same underlying scent of copper and decay, and both exhibited subtle, persistent muscle twitches. On the second arrival, Mrs. Gable, a woman in her late 60s, found in her garden. The twitching was more pronounced, fingers on her left hand curling and uncurling slightly. "Okay, this is getting seriously weird," Ben said, his voice hushed as we transferred Mrs. Gable to a gurney. "3 in a row? Like this?" "Document everything, Ben," I instructed, trying to keep my own voice steady. "Temperature, rigor state, location, and nature of wounds, any anomalous movements, everything." My scientific mind, the part trained to observe and analyze the processes of death, was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. These weren't normal post-mortem changes. Eleanor came down around noon, frowning at the sudden influx. "Police scanners are going wild," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. She wasn't above pitching in when needed. "Reports of riots downtown, some kind of chemical spill maybe. They're locking down the hospital." "It's not a chemical spill." "Eleanor?" I said, gesturing towards the 3 shrouded forms awaiting transport to the cooler. "It's these. Something's happening to the victims, the bites. They're not normal. And the bodies. They're not acting dead." Eleanor looked skeptical. "Art people die in strange ways. Grief does funny things, maybe the attackers were on something. And post-mortem spasms are normal." "Not like this," I insisted. "The rigor is too fast, the lividity is wrong, and the twitches, they're almost coordinated. And the smell." She sighed, rubbing her temples. "Look, just get them into storage. We'll wait for the coroner. Don't go jumping to conclusions based on a few unusual cases." She clearly didn't want to believe it, wanted a rational explanation. Part of me did too. But the evidence on my tables was contradicting decades of established forensic science. We moved the 3 bodies to the refrigerated storage unit, Azar, walk-in cooler lined with stainless steel racks. The cold air hit me, a welcome contrast to the growing unease. As I slid Mrs. Gable onto a shelf, her hand brushed against mine. It wasn't ice cold, as it should have been after hours post-mortem, and initial cooling. There was a residual warmth, faint but undeniable, and beneath the gray pallor of her skin, I could swear I saw a network of faint dark lines, like veins filled with black ink, pulsing faintly just beneath the surface. I pulled my hand back quickly. "Did you feel that?" I asked Ben, who was securing Abernathy's gurney. "Feel what?" Her hand, it was warm. Ben shook his head, not meeting my eyes. "Probably just residual body heat, Art. Or maybe the room isn't cooling properly." He slammed the cooler door shut, the heavy thud echoing in the quiet hallway. He was scared. I could see it in the tightness around his eyes, the way he avoided looking directly at the bodies now. We returned to the prep room, the silence thick with unspoken fear. I started cleaning the instruments, the familiar routine usually calming. But today it just felt like going through the motions before something terrible happened. The radio in the corner, usually tuned to a soft rock station, was broadcasting an emergency alert tone followed by a garbled message. "Remain indoors. Reports of widespread violence. Pathogen confirmed. Transmitted through bodily fluids, bites. Avoid contact." The message repeated, getting clearer, then dissolving into static again. "Pathogen transmitted through bites. My blood ran cold. I looked at the closed door of the cooler, thinking about Abernathy, Gable, the third victim. Thinking about the twitches, the warmth, the bite marks. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her face pale, her usual composure gone. Art, the phones are dead, internet's down. And listen. From outside, faint at first but growing louder, came the sounds of chaos. Screams, shattering glass, car alarms, and that low, guttural moaning, closer now, seemingly coming from multiple directions. It wasn't riots, it wasn't a chemical spill. It was Abernathy, it was Gable. It was happening everywhere. The dead weren't staying dead, and I had 3 of them, maybe more soon, locked in my cooler. The first day wasn't even over, and my quiet funeral home was about to become ground zero. The sounds from outside intensified through the afternoon. The constant background hum of sirens had morphed into a chaotic cacophony, punctuated by sporadic gunfire and horrifying animalistic shrieks that didn't sound entirely human. Through the high, barred windows of the prep room, we could see smoke rising from several points downtown. The world beyond our reinforced walls was collapsing. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with dread. Eleanor had tried the landlines again, uselessly. Her attempts to reach her husband, her son, had failed. She paced the reception area like a caged animal, her earlier pragmatism shattered, leaving only raw fear. Ben stayed close to me in the prep room, compulsively cleaning already sterile surfaces, his eyes wide and darting toward the cooler door every few minutes. "We should barricade the main entrance," Ben suggested, his voice trembling slightly. "The glass doors won't hold for 5 seconds if they want in," I said grimly. "Our best bet is down here, concrete walls, steel doors. We need to secure this level." The funeral home's layout was relatively simple. Ground floor had the reception, viewing, rooms, Eleanor's office, and the main chapel. The basement housed the prep room, the cooler, storage closets, the casket selection room, and the old furnace room. Heavy fire doors separated the basement stairwell from the ground floor. Those were our first line of defense. "Okay," I said, forcing my voice into the calm, authoritative tone I used when instructing Ben on a difficult procedure. "Basement lockdown. Ben, check the fire door at the top of the stairs. Make sure the deadbolt is thrown and see if we can brace it with something from storage. I'll check the cooler." Ben nodded, grateful for the task, and headed up the stairs. I approached the walk-in cooler, my hand hovering over the heavy latch. The residual warmth I'd felt on Mrs. Gable earlier, it couldn't be ignored. I pulled on heavy-duty nitrile gloves and cracked the door open. The rush of cold air carried that same wrong smell, stronger now, cloying. The temperature gauge inside read 38 degrees Fahrenheit, standard for preservation. The 3 bodies lay still, on their shelves, shrouded and tagged. I shone my flashlight on Abernathy first. His shroud seemed tighter, as if the form beneath had shifted. I reached out, hesitated, then slowly pulled back the sheet. His eyes snapped open. I stumbled back, stifling a yell. They weren't the milky, unfocused eyes of the dead. They were clouded, yes, but tracking, fixing on me with malevolent intensity. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound utterly alien coming from a body I knew was hours past clinical death. His jaw worked, teeth grinding. The bite marks on his neck looked inflamed, pulsing faintly with those dark, thread-like lines I'd seen on Mrs. Gable. I slammed the cooler door shut, throwing the heavy external latch and fumbling to slide the key, locking bolt home. My heart hammered against my ribs. They weren't just twitching anymore, they were waking up. Ben came clattering back down the stairs, face ashen. Fire doors bolted and I wedged the old casket dolly against it. But Art, "There's banging upstairs at the front doors, lots of them." "They're getting up, Ben," I said, my voice hoarse. "The ones in the cooler, Abernathy." He opened his eyes. Ben's eyes widened further. "Oh God, oh God." "Focus!" I grabbed his shoulders, forcing him to meet my gaze. "Panic later. Secure. Now, how many other ways into the basement?" "Just the casket lift," he stammered, pointing down the hall toward the room where caskets were brought down from the delivery bay. And the old coal chute in the furnace room, but that's been sealed for years. Check the lift controls. Disable it. Cut the power if you have to. I'll check the chute. We split up. The casket lift was a simple hydraulic platform. Ben found the breaker panel nearby and shut off power to the lift motor. I headed to the furnace room, a relic from when the building used coal heat. It was damp, dusty, filled with cobwebs and discarded junk. The coal chute was a square metal door set, high in the wall, bolted shut from the inside and covered in decades of grime. It looked secure. As I shone my light around the grimy space, my beam fell on something leaning against the wall, an old fire axe, handle weathered but the head still sharp beneath a layer of dust. I grabbed it. It felt heavy, solid, somehow more reassuring than the scalpels and trocars in the prep room. I rejoined Ben in the main basement corridor just as a heavy thud reverberated from the cooler door. Then another. Something inside was hitting the door. Hard. "They're trying to get out," Ben whispered, backing away. Thud, thud. The heavy steel door bulged slightly with each impact. The locking bolt held, but for how long? The prep room, I decided. It's the most secure, steel door, minimal windows. We retreated, glancing nervously back at the shuddering cooler door. Inside the prep room, I threw the deadbolt on the heavy door connecting to the hallway. It clicked satisfyingly into place. We were sealed in. For now. But the sounds didn't stop. We could still hear the muffled thudding from the cooler down, the hall, and now, fainter but unmistakable, scratching sounds from the hallway side of the prep room door. Something was out there. Had one gotten out of the cooler already? Or had something else found its way down here? We were trapped in the heart of the funeral home, surrounded by the tools of our trade. Scalpels, bone saws, trocars, embalming fluid. While the dead we were supposed to be preparing were trying to break in. Or worse, break out. The chemical. Smell of formaldehyde suddenly seemed sickeningly sweet, masking the underlying stench of rot and the impossible reanimation happening just beyond the steel door. The power flickered again, the emergency lights overhead wavering. Then, darkness. The backup generator downstairs kicked in after a few seconds, restoring the dim emergency lights, but the main ventilation system stayed silent. The air immediately felt heavier, closer, and the sounds seemed louder. The thudding from the cooler, the scratching at our door, and now, a new sound. A low, collective moaning emanating from the cooler. Not just one voice, but several, blending into a horrifying chorus. "How many more bodies did Eleanor say were coming?" Ben asked, his back pressed against the far wall, eyes fixed on the door. "She just said the coroner was swamped." My words trailed off as the implications hit me. We didn't know how many were in there now. The coroner's office, overwhelmed, might have sent transfers without proper paperwork in the escalating chaos. There could be 5, 10, more, each one a ticking time bomb waiting to reanimate. The scratching at the prep room door intensified, accompanied by wet, guttural snarls. It wasn't just random anymore. It sounded purposeful. Testing the door frame, the lock. I hefted the fire axe. Ben grabbed a trocar, a long pointed instrument used for aspiration, holding it like a makeshift spear. We stood side by side, facing the door, listening to the sounds of the dead trying to reach the living. Then, the thudding from the cooler stopped. Silence fell in the hallway beyond our door, save for the low moaning. The scratching ceased. "Did they give up?" Ben whispered. Before I could answer, a deafening crash echoed from down the hall. The cooler door. They'd broken through. A wave of guttural moans and shuffling footsteps immediately filled the basement corridor, moving closer. They knew we were in here. The steel door was our only protection, and it wouldn't hold forever against a determined assault from multiple reanimated corpses. The first heavy blow hit the prep room door, making the metal reverberate. They were here. The dead I had handled, washed, prepared for their final rest, were now trying to tear their way in to make this my final rest. The first 12 hours were ending, and the siege of the prep room was just beginning. The assault on the prep room door was relentless. Heavy, wet thuds punctuated by scraping sounds and those awful, gurgling moans. The steel door held, but the frame was starting to buckle inwards near the deadbolt. Bits of plaster dust rained down from the ceiling with each impact. "How many do you think are out there?" Ben asked, his voice tight. Trokar held at the ready. "From the cooler? At least 3, plus whatever else came down from upstairs or followed us," I added, remembering the scratching we'd heard before the cooler breach. I shone my flashlight around the prep room, taking stock. Stainless steel tables, instrument trays, cabinets filled with chemicals, the embalming machine silent, in the corner. Tools of preservation, now potential weapons. "The chemicals?" Ben started, looking at the rows of bottles. Formaldehyde, methanol, various tissue fillers and dyes. "Can we use them?" "Against what?" "They don't breathe, Ben. Poison gas won't work. And splashing formaldehyde isn't going to stop something that shrugs off massive tissue damage." I hefted the fire axe again. "It's going to come down to this. Destroying the brainstem, like Dr. Reynolds said on that broadcast." Remembering the frantic, terrified voice of the CDC scientist before the transmission cut out. Headshots only. Another heavy blow hit the door, stronger this time. A definite dent appeared in the steel near the handle. "They're getting through," Ben yelled. "The tables!" I shouted back. "Tip them against the door, now!" We wrestled with the heavy stainless steel embalming tables, shoving them end first against the door. They were cumbersome but solid, adding another layer of reinforcement. The impacts continued, but the tables absorbed some of the force, the metal groaning in protest. "How long can that hold?" Ben panted, leaning against the wall. "Not long enough." I scanned the room again. We needed a fallback, or a way out. The only other exit was a small ventilation shaft near the ceiling, covered by a metal grill. Too small for us to fit through, even if we could reach it and pry it open. We were trapped. Then I remembered the drains. Set into the center of the concrete floor were large drains for fluid runoff during the embalming process. They fed into the building's main sewer line. It was a disgusting thought, crawling through sewer pipes, but it might be the only way out, if the door failed completely. "Ben, the floor drains, can we lift the grates?" We hurried over, tools in hand. The grates were heavy cast iron, set flush with the floor. Using the pry bar end of the fire axe and a heavy wrench Ben found, we managed to lift one edge of the nearest grate. The smell that wafted up was foul. Old chemicals, stagnant water, and something else. That same coppery rot. My stomach churned, but I shone the flashlight down. The pipe was wide, maybe 3 feet in diameter, sloping downward. It was coated in slime, but it looked passable. "If the door goes, that's our exit," I said grimly. "Grab anything useful that's portable. First aid kit, water bottles, maybe some of the smaller tools." As Ben gathered supplies, stuffing them into a discarded supply bag, I kept watch on the door. The pounding was less frequent now, replaced by a more persistent scraping and pushing. Were they weakening? Or trying a different tactic? I heard a new sound, a rhythmic grinding, metal on metal, the hinges. They were trying to force the hinges. "They're learning," I whispered, the realization colder than the basement air. These weren't just mindless shamblers. Maybe the virus rewired more than just the brainstem. Maybe some residual intelligence, some problem-solving ability remained. Or maybe something else was guiding them. The grinding stopped. A moment of silence, then a sickening screech as the top hinge gave way. The door sagged inward at the top corner, revealing a dark gap. A pale hand with dirty broken fingernails snaked through the opening, scrabbling blindly. "Time to go," I yelled, grabbing the axe. Ben scrambled toward the open drain. I took one last look at the prep room, my sanctuary turned prison, then turned to face the door. Another hand appeared in the gap, then a face pressed against the opening. Mrs. Gable. Her eyes were milky white, jaw hanging slack, dark fluid dripping from her chin. The bite marks on her neck pulsed visibly. She let out a low moan, a sound of pure, empty hunger. I swung the axe. The heavy blade bit deep into the door frame next to her head, trying to wedge the door shut, buying Ben time. Mrs. Gable hissed, withdrawing slightly. Behind her I could see Abernathy pushing, his face a rictus of mindless aggression. Art. "Come on," Ben shouted from the edge of the drain. The bottom hinge screeched, starting to give. The door wouldn't hold for more than a few seconds. I pulled the axe free and back toward the drain, keeping my eyes locked on the widening gap. More faces appeared, the third victim from the cooler, and others I didn't recognize, their forms indistinct in the dim emergency light filtering down the hall. They surged forward as the door finally ripped free from its frame, crashing inward, against the tables we'd used as barricades. I didn't hesitate. I swung myself down into the drain opening, landing awkwardly in the muck below. Ben was already moving down the sloping pipe, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness ahead. Above, the sounds of the dead pouring into the prep room, overturning, tables crashing into cabinets. I looked up one last time and saw Abernathy's face peering down into the drain, eyes glowing faintly red in the darkness, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Then I turned and followed Ben into the suffocating blackness of the sewer pipe, the sounds of the horde fading behind us, replaced by the gurgle of stagnant water and the frantic pounding of my own heart. We scrambled through the slime-coated pipe, the stench thick enough to taste. Ben's flashlight beam bobbed ahead, our only guide in the absolute darkness. The pipe sloped downwards, slippery underfoot. Twice I nearly lost my footing, catching myself on the rough concrete walls. Behind us I could hear faint scraping sounds, echoing strangely in the confined space. Were they following? Could they navigate these pipes? "Where does this lead?" Ben gasped, pausing to catch his breath. "Should connect to the main city sewer line under Elm Street," I replied, consulting a mental map of the neighborhood. "From there, I don't know. Maybe we can find a maintenance access ladder somewhere, away from the funeral home." We pressed on, the silence broken only by our ragged breathing and the drip of unseen water. The air grew steadily fouler. After what felt like an eternity, maybe 20 minutes, the pipe widened slightly and opened into a larger junction, a nexus where several pipes converged. Stagnant water pooled ankle-deep here, reflecting our flashlight beams onto walls coated in decades of grime and God knows what else. "Which way?" Ben asked, shining his light down the different tunnels. "Main line should be the largest diameter," I said, pointing to a pipe easily 5 feet across. "That way." We waded through the fetid water into the main sewer line. The ceiling was higher here, allowing us to stand almost upright. The flow of water was sluggish but noticeable, carrying indeterminate debris past our legs. The smell was overwhelming, but strangely, the coppery rot scent of the infected was absent here. Maybe the flowing water diluted it. Or maybe they hadn't ventured this far yet. We followed the main line, moving as quickly as the slippery footing allowed. Every 100 yards or so, we passed smaller feeder pipes joining the main tunnel. And occasionally, set high in the curved ceiling, were maintenance access shafts, ladders leading up to manhole covers on the streets above. "Should we try one?" Ben asked, pointing his light up at a rusty ladder disappearing into darkness. "Too risky," I shook my head. "We have no idea what's directly above. Could open a manhole right into the middle of a horde. Better to keep moving, put distance between us and Hawthorne and Sons." Suddenly Ben stopped, grabbing my arm. "Listen." I strained my ears over the gurgle of the sewer water. Faintly, from the direction we'd come, echoing down the tunnel, shuffling footsteps, multiple sets accompanied by low moans. They were following us, and they were faster than I'd expected in this terrain. "Move." We broke into a stumbling run, splashing through the filthy water. The sounds behind us grew louder, closer. They weren't tiring. They didn't need to breathe. They would just keep coming. Up ahead, my flashlight beam caught another access shaft. This one looking newer, less rusted than the others. This one, I decided, no choice now. Ben scrambled up the ladder first. I covered our retreat, flashlight beams sweeping back down the tunnel. Dark shapes were visible now, maybe 50 yards away, moving steadily through the gloom, their eyes reflecting the light like predatory animals. I fired up the ladder, pulling myself onto the small platform beneath the manhole cover. Ben was already struggling with the heavy iron lid. "It's jammed," he grunted, straining. I added my weight, using the axe handle for leverage. The sounds from below grew louder, the first of the infected reaching the base of the ladder. A hand grasped at my dangling foot. With a final desperate heave, the manhole cover shifted, scraping open just enough for us to squeeze through. Ben went first, scrambling out onto the street above. I followed, kicking frantically at the grasping hands below, then slammed the heavy cover back into place with a deafening clang. We found ourselves in a deserted intersection. Streetlights were out, casting the area in deep shadow, lit only by the moon and the distant orange glow of fires downtown. Cars were abandoned. Haphazardly, some crashed, doors open. Silence except for the wind whistling through broken windows. "Where are we?" Ben panted, looking around wildly. I recognized the street signs. Oak and 3rd, about 6 blocks south of the funeral home. We'd made it out of the immediate vicinity, but we were far from safe. The sounds of chaos, distant screams, gunfire, still echoed from the city center. "We need to find somewhere safe," Ben said. "Somewhere fortified." "Nowhere is safe," I corrected grimly. "Only safer. We need weapons, supplies, information." I thought about the police station, the hospital, both likely overrun by now. My apartment, it's only a few blocks from here. Top floor, decent locks. Not ideal, but better than the street. "What about Eleanor?" Ben asked suddenly. "We just left her." Guilt washed over me. In the panic, I hadn't thought about her. "We couldn't have gotten her out through the sewers," I said, the excuse sounding lame even to me. Maybe she found a way out. But I doubted it. The banging we'd heard on the fire door upstairs. Before we could debate further, a low moan came from a nearby alleyway. We both froze. A figure shambled out into the intersection. An infected police officer, uniform torn, one arm hanging uselessly, the other hand still clutching a service pistol. It saw us. Its head snapped up, red eyes fixing on us, and it let out that horrible gurgling snarl before breaking into a clumsy run. "Move!" I yelled, pulling Ben toward the nearest shadowed doorway. We needed to get off the street, regroup, make a plan. The dead officer was just one. More would be drawn by any noise we made. We ducked into the recessed entrance of a closed bookstore, just as the infected officer shuffled past, its attention drawn further down the street by a distant car alarm. We pressed ourselves into the shadows, catching our breath. "Okay," I whispered. "Apartment is 3 blocks west." We move quiet, cover to cover. Stick to the shadows. Ready? Ben nodded, gripping the trocar tightly, his knuckles white. We slipped back onto the street, moving like ghosts through the wreckage of our town. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every distant sound set our nerves on edge. As we crept past a darkened storefront, I caught our reflection in the glass. 2 figures, smeared with filth from the sewer, one clutching a fire axe, the other, a Mortician's trocar. We looked like specters ourselves, haunting the ruins of the world we knew. The first day was over. 12 hours of escalating horror had passed since Mr. Abernathy arrived on my table. The dead were walking, the city was falling, and we were 2 mortuary workers armed with little more than specialized tools and the terrifying knowledge of what happened to bodies after the bite. Survival wasn't going to be about finding a safe zone. It was going to be about understanding the enemy, and nobody understood the dead better than the man who worked with them every day. The thought offered little comfort as we melted back into the shadows, the faint, coppery smell of rot, seeming to follow us down the empty street. The nightmare was just beginning, and the bodies I knew so well were now the monsters hunting in the dark.